Barton was really nice and allowed me to record. That way, if the volunteers are not able to make it, or maybe they missed the first part of this training, then I can go ahead and send it out via email. And of course, I'll send it to everybody. So welcome, Barton. Will you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Nice to meet all of you. I'm Barton Bailey. I'm the Pride Center Director at the Coastal Bend Wellness Foundation. I have been part of the Corpus Christi community for my whole life. I'm a local boy who is born and raised right here in Corpus. I love Corpus Christi and the surrounding area. And I have always kind of been involved in what I consider helping professions wherever I've worked and wherever I've been. So as the Pride Center Director, the Pride Center is a LGBTQ community center, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. That's just really a little bit about me. I have some kids. I have 3 children who are 16, 13, and 11. So I'm busy chasing around kids still, and just I'm glad to be a part of this time with you together today. I guess we'll go ahead and start. Is that okay, Nicole? And so I'm going to share my screen so that way y'all can see. Just one second.
And I did give you access to share. If you're having issues, let me know. Oh, I see it. We're good.
Great. We're going to talk a little bit about youth issues in the LGBTQ community. And this is kind of part of an abbreviated version of our Safe Zone training. Safe Zone is that we, with businesses and organizations, try to create a safe space for folks who are LGBTQ to feel that they can come and talk and be themselves. And so we do training around the Coastal Bend, Safe Zone training, where we go talk to different groups about the LGBTQ community in the Coastal Bend. Each LGBTQ community in every area is a little bit different. They have some of their own language that they speak and say, and some of their own ways of relating. And so we're just going to talk about some of those things today. The purpose of the training today is not to challenge any personal beliefs that you might have or to change any personal points of view. Our real purpose is to give you some information and dispel any myths about the LGBTQ community. It's really about engaging in dialogue together for you to know who the LGBTQ plus community in the Corpus Christi area is, for you to know about community health and wellness, and and really it's about that this community is not asking for any special treatment. They're really just asking for equal treatment. We'll have time where we'll interact, and I'll have we'll just do some free talking with each other as a group as well. And if you're not part of the LGBTQ community here in Corpus Christi, then I hope you'll consider being an ally. An ally is really critical to those who are LGBTQ. It's someone who will stand beside them and support them, someone who is active and speaks up when you see discrimination going on. And so if you don't identify as LGBTQ, I hope that you would consider being an ally as well. Let's see here. Let me see if I can get my presentation to move forward. There it goes. Just a little bit about the Coastal Bend Wellness Foundation. We were founded in 1986 here in the Coastal Bend. If you've been around here, you may have known us as the Coastal Bend AIDS Foundation. And it was formed by a group of concerned citizens in the 80s who wanted to help people who were dying of HIV and AIDS. And so they banded together and they decided to deliver blankets and food from the trunks of their cars. And that's how our organization began. It really started focused on AIDS and HIV in the 80s, and over time has grown and changed facilities several times and changed names. And now it's the Coastal Bend Wellness Foundation. And we provide all sorts of services for health and wellness, not just focused on AIDS. But there's always been a link to the LGBTQ community as part of the Coastal Bend Wellness Foundation because of the predominance of HIV and AIDS in the LGBTQ community that spread through contact of men having sex with men primarily. So there's always been that link to the Wellness Foundation. And so it was only natural for the Wellness Foundation, as they moved into their new building about 2 years ago, to want to have a LGBTQ community center that would focus on the needs of those who identified as LGBTQ+. And so that's how the Pride Center came to being, and that's how I became the Pride Center director. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that for a few minutes, but just to highlight some of the programs and services that are offered at the Coastal Bend Wellness Foundation. We have healthcare that includes sexual health. It includes just general wellness, and we have a Breast Friends program that really does prosthetic fittings for breast cancer survivors. We have a mobile clinic. We do a lot of community outreach in a 12-county region surrounding Nueces County. We have a youth program for LGBTQ+, a senior program for LGBTQ+, and we now have a new transgender program and trans family program as well. So there's a lot of different services that are offered here. You do not have to be LGBTQ to come to the Wellness Foundation. In fact, majority of our clients are not. They come for medical clinic checkups with the doctor and for routine testing for things like diabetes. So there's a lot of different services that are offered here for healthcare. Also, we have behavioral health. So we have a counseling program. We have LPCs, licensed counselors in the state of Texas, who work here, and they do some substance abuse and outpatient treatment. We also have youth programs that focus on, there's a Say No to Drugs and a Safe Sex program. And so those are part of our youth programs. We have some outreach that we do as well. We have a sex worker diversion program. So just lots of community focused programs. One of the things that I've appreciated about the Coastal Bend Wellness Foundation here during COVID is that they were one of the organizations who really was the first to push for community-wide testing and vaccines to be available for all people. One of the things that really impressed me before I even started working here is that the Wellness Foundation really was one of the ones that I saw out in the community providing testing over and over again during COVID. So really, the Wellness Foundation is that group of folks who are kind of sometimes brave when they don't know what might happen. They rush in to try to find a solution to those who might be hurting and might need some care. A little bit about the Pride Center is we offer a variety of programs for those who are LGBTQ. We are the only LGBTQ community center south of San Antonio, and the only one in an 11,000 square mile region. So that's why we felt like it was really important to have one here in South Texas. We have a youth program that's called Why Not? Youth Network Out Together, a transgender support group, a trans family support group for family members of those who are transgender. And like I said, we have kind of a 40+ program as well. We've been looking at starting some intramural sports leagues and some other community and building type activities. In 2 weeks, we have our LGBTQ prom, and so we're really getting geared up for that and excited about that. We have a book club, a clothes closet, a food pantry, all sorts of things like that that look out to and help to care for those in our LGBTQ plus community. One of the things that we do also is we promote what's called GSAs, Gay Straight Alliances. And those are groups that form within each high school, as there are youth that want to have a club that's focused on the needs of those who are LGBTQ plus. They contact their school administration and petition to have a club. And so our newest one is in Calallen. We also work closely with our local colleges and universities also for their GSAs on their campuses. We talked about if you don't identify as LGBTQ, that you would consider being an ally. An ally is somebody who really believes that everyone deserves the right to equality and respect. And you're somebody who doesn't tolerate discriminatory behavior, whether it's in your organization or just privately. And you're somebody who really wants to work within your organization to form new relationships and to really make an impact on the local community in a positive way. So now we're going to start in an area where we kind of have a little interaction, especially the next slide after this. But we're going to start by talking about the gender unicorn. Let's see. Before we do that, does anybody have any questions of me before I move forward with the gender unicorn?
I actually have one question that I was thinking about when I was looking at all these services that you offer. I noticed that not a lot of services are being offered here in Clayburgh County. Do you think that might just be because of the openness of the community to have people come in?
Yes, I mean, we do have like a mobile clinic that goes to the surrounding counties, and we do work with different organizations and groups that are LGBTQ plus in different counties. Like we work with A&M Kingsville, and we worked with high school teachers in in like Sinton and Taft area, and some school nurses out in that direction. So we are more than willing to get out to our surrounding counties and work with them. But you're probably right. The rural areas, especially ones that are more rural, tend to, there's even a stigma with when we go and park somewhere at a community center in a local area, there's a stigma with going into the Coastal Bend Wellness Foundation mobile clinic. So sometimes we just really have to identify some folks in our area.
Yeah, that's so unfortunate, because I would love to see the Gay Straight Alliance in our schools here in the high school. I think
I'd be glad to help promote that. It really is dependent upon finding some students who are more than willing to bring that forward to their school administration. And so I'd be always willing to help some youth figure out ways to do that.
And I have a question in the comments here from Nancy. She asked, do you have Jim Wells, Duval, Brooks, etc. schools? I guess, what area do you cover? What's your service area?
I have to look. I believe that all of those, if I remember right, are in our service area. It's really the 11 surrounding counties that surround Nueces. So that should be in our service area. I don't know that there are any GSAs in some of those schools at this time. But I'd love to start some GSAs in more rural areas. And right now we have an intern, and we have another one that's coming. And so that's kind of one of our goals, is to get out into the rural areas and to form more GSAs. It's been real challenging with COVID-19 because a lot of our active GSAs have become inactive just due to the fact that a lot of students weren't meeting physically on campus. And so we hope to revive some of those, and that includes kind of expanding into our rural areas. I've just been here about 6 months as the director, and so that's been one of my goals, is to include that expansion into our rural areas more.
Awesome, thank
And
you. Go ahead, Jen.
you mentioned that you were the only center, south of San Antonio. Did you mention how many people you serve now?
No, I did not. That's a great question. We've run some numbers on that, and we serve about 100 folks monthly is probably the best way. Between our youth program serves about 20 youth a month that come to our every other week meeting. And then we have weekly trans meetings and trans family meetings, which have anywhere from 10 to 20 in them. And then we have a lot of more kind of monthly or quarterly events. And those tend to be larger events. We try to get out into our community to promote understanding of LGBTQ issues. And so we got into the bars to promote safe sex and knowledge of the services we provide, like the food pantry and some of those things. And we also go out and just do a lot of times by providing some entertainment, it also gives us a chance to table and get to know our community. And so we have some folks who do drag shows. And so we at some of the local bars, which allows us then to also be a kind of a greater part of the larger community as well.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? All right, well, let's talk about the gender unicorn for a few minutes. You see the gender unicorn in front of you, and this is really a way for us to talk about gender identity and expression and attraction. And so if you look at the gender unicorn, it's really just a kind of a good infographic that was developed. Sometimes it's called the gingerbread person, but we like to use the gender unicorn better. If you look at the gender unicorn, you'll see a few things. You'll see the first one is that the gender unicorn is thinking about a rainbow, and so the gender unicorn in thinking about the rainbow is really thinking about the unicorn's identity. So your gender identity is an internal understanding of gender. How do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as a female or a woman or a girl? Do you see yourself as a male, a man, or a boy? Or do you see yourself maybe as something in between or not at all? And so really your gender identity is your own internal understanding of gender, of how you see yourself. So that's gender identity, is internal. Your gender expression is the gender unicorn, you'll see, has the little green dots all the way around it. And your gender expression is how we express ourselves to those around us. It's typically found in how we dress. So if you, in the US, if you stereotypically express yourself as feminine, that means you dress in certain ways. How would you think that would be if you're expressing yourself as feminine? Give me some examples.
Wearing nail polish and makeup.
Correct. Are there some others?
Dresses, very girly kind of things like that.
Correct. The way long hair is also kind of considered a gender expression. All of those ways are typical ways that females express themselves in the US. And so that's your expression. If you identify as feminine, if you identify as masculine, your gender expression in South Texas would be jeans and boots and short hair and maybe stereotypically a cowboy hat. You know, that's a masculine gender expression typically, or baseball cap. So you might express yourself either feminine or masculine, or maybe something in between that, or maybe in a way that really doesn't identify you as feminine or masculine at all. Sometimes those are people that we call, well, that's that girl who's dresses like a tomboy, or that guy, he always wears a muscle shirt, or maybe that guy is, we call them very metro. So those are expressions of, and that's external. Part of our expressions are also the names that we have for ourselves, the pronouns that we use. So in addition to our clothing and hair, those are some gender expressions. Also, some expressions are the roles we have at work or at home. Are they more masculine or feminine roles? So there's lots of different ways that we can express ourselves. That's gender expression. Then there's sex assigned at birth. You'll see that in between the gender unicorn's legs. The sex assigned at birth is basically when the baby is about to arrive and mother is giving birth, and the baby arrives and the doctor holds up the baby and looks at the baby in between the baby's legs, depending on what's in between the baby's legs, and says, it's a girl, or congratulations, it's a boy. Generally, our sex assigned at birth is done visually. It's a visual inspection at the hospital. Occasionally, there's something happens where it's not clear that the baby is either male or female. Most of the time, they might look male or female in terms of their anatomy, but as the child grows into puberty, it becomes aware that maybe the female is not developing as she should, or the male is not developing facial hair or a deepening voice. And so a lot of times in youth, it becomes aware that maybe the sex assigned at birth, there's been a chromosomal anomaly that happens, or sometimes there's ambiguous genitalia. The genitalia doesn't form as it should, and that happens. That's called being intersexed, and that's usually done by a DNA or chromosomal analysis, and usually most of the time they find that out later on in life, in youth, primarily at puberty. So most of the time your sex assigned at birth is either female or male. Then on the gender unicorn, there are two hearts there, and that's who we're physically and emotionally attracted to. So who do we look at and think, wow, that person really does it for me? I'm really physically attracted to that person. Or who we're emotionally attracted to, somebody who we talk to and get to know, and we think, wow, I have a deep connection with them. And so who we're physically and emotionally attracted to is really based on how our heart is drawn to people. It's really described as the person who kind of floats your boat or gets you hot and bothered. Those are the people that we're generally physically or emotionally attracted to. So all of those things really make up who we are in our identity. And so that's a little bit about the gender unicorn. Just to let you know about that, the way that we identify can fall in a very typical path. So let's say we have a gender identity, someone identifies as female, and they express themselves by wearing makeup and skirts and flowery things, so they express themselves as feminine. Let's say their sex assigned at birth is female, and let's say they're attracted to men and are emotionally attracted to men. That would be somebody that we would call a heterosexual or straight. But it doesn't have to be that way. There can be someone who identifies as female, but they may express themselves by wearing both masculine and feminine clothing. Their sex assigned at birth may be male, and they may be physically attracted to both men and women. And so that person might be considered transgender if that happens. So I just bring those two examples to show you that anywhere along the line can your gender identity expression and who you're attracted to and your sex assigned at birth kind of hop along that spectrum there. And so it's really important that you don't get sexuality and gender confused with one another. Your gender identity, your gender expression, your biological sex, and your sexual orientation are all independent of one another. They are not really connected. A person's sexual orientation doesn't determine their gender expression, and their gender expression isn't determined by their gender identity, and their gender identity isn't determined by their biological sex. All those things can affect one another, but they don't determine one another. You can zigzag through that list if you want, and many people do. So this slide really helps to, I hope, kind of clearly identify gender issues. Do you have any questions about this slide? No, everybody's good? Okay, great. You're always welcome to call out any questions you have, and I'll pause at points for questions that you might have.
I just have questions when it comes to pronouns, but will we get there or should I ask now?
We'll get there. Okay.
Okay.
We'll talk about pronouns in just a few minutes.
Okay, I'll hold the question.
Okay. And we're going to talk for a few minutes about some sexual orientation and gender identity terminology, and we're going to go quickly through these. And so your head might be spinning a little bit at the end because they'll be really fast. But there's no wrong answers here. We're learning together. If there are some of these that you say, I just don't know this, Barton, or I don't know, Barton, I just don't know how to even describe that. That's okay. That's part of going through some of this terminology. You may think, well, why are we going through this terminology? Well, it's really important if you have a client who identifies as LGBTQ to be able to know the terminology that they use and to understand it, and to be able to address that terminology properly, or to, when they use terminology, to say, oh, I remember that in training with Barton. Let me go back and refresh myself on that, because you know, I interact with folks all the time, and how they identify is really important to understanding who they are. So this is where I'm going to get your help. So we're going to talk about some of this terminology. When somebody identifies as a lesbian, what does that mean to you? Just kind of your own informal definition. How would you define someone who's lesbian?
someone who is attracted both physically and emotionally to females.
Okay, very good. And the language we use is someone who identifies as a female who's attracted to someone who identifies as a female. That's a lesbian. Gay, how would you define someone who's gay?
Using the new tools we just learned, somebody who identifies as male, who is emotionally and sexually attracted to somebody who identifies as male.
Correct. That's exactly right. And and sometimes we use that term kind of globally for the LGBTQ plus community to include all of those people. We use it kind of as a generic term at times as well. So you kind of have to know, and when somebody says they identify as gay, most of the time they're referring to that they're a male who identifies as male. If they say they're part of like the gay community and they're a female talking, then they're probably talking about the LGBTQ plus community as a whole. Sometimes it's hard to remember all those letters of the alphabet, and people don't want to offend one group by not including them in that group, and so they'll say, "Oh, I'm gay." And that's just a way of just kind of generally saying I'm part of the community. Then there's a bisexual. How would you define someone who's bisexual? Somebody jump in and give it a shot for me.
Come on, people. I want to participate, but I want everyone else to participate too. Okay, Barton, I gotcha. Oh, look, I've got somebody in the comments. Nancy says they have interest in both genders.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yes, thank you. There's a sexual attraction to both male and female. And there's a similar term to that those who are youth use, and that's called pansexual, and we'll talk about that in a moment. I know sometimes it's hard to talk about these terms because we kind of in our minds know what they are, but we haven't verbalized them before. And so really this exercise is really about getting us to think about how do we verbalize that? Because as we're talking to somebody who might identify as LGBTQ, we want to kind of have some clarity in our mind about what each one of these parts of the community, what they each stand for. And so it's important to be able to verbalize that, develop some language around that. Heterosexual, the common word that we use for someone who's heterosexual is what? Anybody can jump in.
Straight.
Great, you got it. And that's typically an opposite sex attraction. Just know that in the LGBTQ community, sometimes being straight and saying that particular word has a negative connotation. I wish there was a better word to use, even I use it, but if you're straight, that implies that if you're not straight, then you're not going the right way or following, the right path, because straight implies there's only one path. But that's the best term that we seem to have to say that informally. You don't hear folks saying, I'm heterosexual. They'll say, I'm straight most of the time. And again, there's homosexual, which is a same-sex attraction. So those are the easy ones. Now we're going to get into some that are a little more challenging, but maybe you've heard of them. There's this term, asexual, and think about atypical, the word atypical, or amorphous. And so those are all words that start with the letter A first. And so if you think about those words, then how does that relate to being asexual? What would that mean to you?
Well, I guess that you really don't identify definitely as either male or female.
Correct. And so if you think about words like atypical or amorphous, asexual is, think about it as like not sexual. The A means not. So like having no attraction or drive to have sex, even when dating. It's like your sexual drive is permanently turned off. It's like a light switch that's permanently turned off.
So it
those-
really doesn't have anything to do with your gender feeling. Is what
correct.
you're oh, okay.
Yes, it really, it's less about gender. Anybody can be asexual, and it's really more about how you feel in terms of wanting to have sex with someone. There are folks who are asexual and married or in a committed relationship, and they do have sex regularly, but they do it really more out of wanting to please their partner. And of course, being asexual is very different than waiting and abstaining from sex until you're married. Sometimes people get those two confused. Really, being asexual means, you might have a bond with somebody, but it might be on an emotional level, or it might be on you have a connection with somebody, but it's really not focused on needing or wanting to have sex with them. Let's see here. The next term is demisexual, and I'll just kind of quickly go through demisexual. Demisexual is really about having the need to have an emotional bond or trust or connection in a relationship before you feel sexual feelings for somebody. It's like the light switch doesn't turn on until a connection exists between two folks. And if you're demisexual, you feel that way strongly. You might have a friend who told you, I was friends with this person and we talked a lot, and I really didn't think anything about it until one day I just looked over at them and I thought, wow, that's the love of my life and I want to be with them forever, and I'm really sexually attracted to them. If they were like that, they might be demisexual. It's like the light switch doesn't turn on until that connection exists. We don't use this term very much, but there are some folks who identify as demisexual. This is another term. This is used a lot by youth, called pansexual. Pansexual is a little bit different than the term across from it, which is bisexual. It's similar, but a little different. If you're bisexual, you're just sexually attracted to someone who is either female or male. It's very clear. You either want to be with someone who's female or male. If you're pansexual, you really are attracted to a person's character. You really are attracted to the connection you have with them. It's really not whether they're male or female. It really has nothing to do with that. Somebody who's pansexual says, well, I'm just attracted to who I'm attracted to, and it doesn't matter if they're male or female or trans or asexual, or it doesn't matter what they are. It's really about the connection I have with them. That's someone who is pansexual. Among youth, if you work with youth, you'll have a lot of youth who, if their sexual identity comes up, may tell you they're pan. They tell you they're pan. Most of the time they're doing this to let you know that maybe they're young and maybe they don't know quite what they are yet, but they know they're not straight. And they haven't had enough sexual experiences to really know beyond that. And they really don't know you well enough that if they know that they're lesbian or bisexual or gay, that they really don't they don't know you well enough to want to reveal that to you. And so a very general way of saying they're part of the LGBTQ community without having to be specific, especially if they don't know you, is for them to say, I'm pan. And so if you hear a youth say they're pan, it might be because they really are, but sometimes it's because they really don't know fully yet, or they really don't want to tell you yet what letter of the alphabet they are in the LGBTQ alphabet. Okay, so just know that. Queer, that's a word that's really loaded in our LGBTQ community, because if you're about 40 plus, you see queer as a very negative term. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, if you were called queer, that was really considered a hateful thing. And so folks who are older and part of the LGBTQ community very much dislike that word. Please don't use that around them. As youth have come into being, they've come to own that word. And so you'll hear a lot of youth say, well, I'm queer. And that's also another way of them letting you know, hey, I'm young, I haven't really figured all this out yet, but I know that I'm not straight. And so if I'm not straight, then I'm part of the LGBTQ community. I just don't know what that is yet. And so I'm just going to tell you I'm queer, because I don't really want you to know my business yet, and I might not even know it yet. So that's another way that youth have started to own that. You'll really hear that among youth, and it's okay for you to use that among youth, especially if you hear them use it first. They say, hey, I'm queer, then just know that that's a positive thing for them. Let's see, there's a few others. There's all the phobias. There's biphobia and homophobia and transphobia. And so, you know, it's not like arachnophobia where somebody's deathly afraid of spiders. Really, biphobia or transphobia or homophobia is really about having a lack of understanding about somebody who's different from you, and having maybe an aversion to that because you don't understand. I get folks all the time who, when I talk about homophobia, who say, well, I'm not afraid of gay people. And really, homophobia isn't about being afraid of them. It's really about just having kind of an aversion, an intense aversion, or that's coupled with kind of a lack of understanding. So just to kind of bring some clarity to that. Okay, so there are some comments I'm going to stop and just take a look at. So yes, we'll talk about this a little bit later. Nancy says that that she has seen that there are several folks who are pan who have suicidal thoughts, and we'll talk about that in the LGBTQ community. The suicide rate is much higher in general, and so we'll talk about that a little later on. But you're right, Nancy. And yes, some people don't, you know, the sexuality is sometimes complicated. And so I know the comment was made that some folks don't just kind of decide what they are until later on, and or who they are. And that's correct. I mean, it's complicated to figure out your own sexuality sometimes, especially depending on how you grew up. You may have grown up in a very conservative environment where that was not allowed, or if you were very much trying to please family members, you very much didn't, if they had an aversion to somebody who's LGBTQ or that community, then you didn't want to disappoint them. Also, your own childhood trauma may inform how you identify, and so sexual abuse can really play into that. So there are lots of different issues that play into when and how we own our own sexual identity. And so sometimes that doesn't happen until later in life. Any questions about the sexual orientation terminology? Okay. We're going to take a breath for a moment. That's a lot of terminology to soak in, I know. And we're going to take a few minutes and talk about some sexual identity terminology. And all of these are important because you'll hear them in the LGBTQ community kind of thrown around. And so I think it's important that if you get to know a client well enough that they tell you, hey, I identify as pan, then you have a really good understanding of what that is, as opposed to being bi or being gay. Or if they say, I'm asexual, I don't really think about sex at all. You really have a good understanding of what that is. I think it's important to identify that terminology so we can kind of speak the same language. So we're going to talk for a few minutes about some gender identity terminology. Remember, gender identity is how we think in our head, right, about who we are. Our gender expression is how we express ourselves primarily through what we wear. Some of our roles in life contribute to our gender expression. So how we express ourselves to the outward world is our gender expression. And then there's this term that's become very prominent in the LGBTQ community, and that's called cisgender. Does anybody know what being cis is and what that means? I'm not hearing any takers here, so I'll volunteer that. If you're, they call it cis for short. If you're cis, it's when your body parts match your identity and expression. So if you're a male and you identify as a male, and then you express yourself by wearing maybe jeans and a shirt and a baseball cap and no makeup and short hair, then you're cisgender. All of those things match. And so they call it being cis. In the LGBTQ community, sometimes they'll joke with each other. If I identify as gay and I come in, in my cowboy boots and my jeans and my cowboy hat, somebody may turn to me and jokingly say, "Well, you're so cis today." And so it just means that I'm a boy who identifies as a boy and I'm dressing like a boy. So sometimes it's just kind of used also in that way, about that you're not very gender fluid in the way that you dress or think. You're very kind of more stereotypically a man or stereotypically a woman in the way you think and act and identify. Then there's transgender, and there's also this other word, transsexual. Transgender is really when one of those three things don't match. When your sex, your expression, and your identity, when one of those three don't match together. So my sex assigned at birth may be a male, but I may really feel in my heart that I identify as a female, and I may dress as a female. Well, that would be considered transgender. And when one of those things really doesn't match the rest, it's the best way I can describe it. And transsexual is really an outdated term. It really has to do with genitalia surgery that trans folks have to match their gender expression and their gender identity. So just to let you know, with being transsexual, with being a transgender, when you're transgender, that's really a transition process. That's what the trans is about transitioning from either being male to female or female to male. And you can be trans and be anywhere along the process. There's no partly being trans. You're being trans when you think of yourself as different than the gender you are. So if, let's say, I was male and I thought of myself as female, then I'm already transgender, just because I really don't think of myself as being the sex that I am. But it doesn't have to be that. Being transgender can be not only thinking about it, but then wanting to express that differently. So if I think of myself as female, then maybe I start wearing more traditionally female clothes or makeup, or that maybe that's not enough for me to feel like I'm fully who I should be. And so I start taking hormones. I start taking estrogen. So that way I start to develop more as a female and grow less body hair, and my voice softens. And so maybe I need to do that in order to be my fully realized self. That would be transgender also. Or maybe I need to feel like I need to really have surgery in addition to all of those things in order to fully transition. And so I would have breast augmentation surgery, or what they call bottom surgery. So that could also be somebody who's transgender. Someone who's transgender can be anywhere along that process. And so I just want you to know that there's no like starting point for that or stopping point, except that you feel that you're not the sex that you were assigned at birth, and you feel that you're something different than that. It can be all very confusing, and so really we just honor what somebody says, and if they say that they're trans, and we honor that no matter where they are in that process, and we don't distinguish between whether they've had surgery or not. So we don't say, are you transgender or are you a transsexual? We don't do any of that. Part of the evolution of being trans is that we just call them trans. We just call someone trans and honor that. And just like you and me, nobody asks questions about what's going on between my legs or what surgeries I've had or how, I give when I introduce myself, I give my name to someone and people accept that. And they don't ask me a million questions about whether I'm a male or a female, and so really honoring someone who's trans is about doing the same with them too. Any questions about that? Okay. We have in our youth group here, we have, I'd say about half of our youth group identifies as trans. So just know it's also an emerging younger population. And there are more children and youth who identify as trans. And they're brave to do that, I think. And so, so just know that if you work with youth, then that's kind of an emerging population. Luis, you asked what's non-binary and gender neutral. Well, you're actually a little bit ahead of us. We're going to get there in just one moment, so just have a little patience with me.
Okay, thank you.
Those are great questions, and so when we get to binary, non-binary, we'll talk about that in just a moment, and we'll work quickly through some of these. This term is intersex. Intersex is, we talked about that before. If you remember on the gender unicorn, it's about someone who has ambiguous genitalia. They either have both genitalia or really not fully formed genitalia that's identified with their sex assigned at birth. It's really about having an extra chromosome, and so they say sometimes it's about having a chromosomal anomaly, which is a big set of words there, but that's intersex. And then I bring two-spirited up because that's really in the Native American Indian community, that that someone who understands both sexes, both the female and male sex, and maybe identifies with both, is really considered someone who has a higher spirit. And so they're called two-spirited. They have a deeper understanding of the universe and the world. And so I just bring that up to show you that in certain cultures, having a nature that is that understands both sexes is really something that's revered. You'll see that in some other cultures by some of their gods, which have both female and male parts as they depict those gods. Here's one called gender non-conforming. What would you think if I use the phrase gender non-conforming? How would you describe someone who's gender non-conforming? And you're welcome to jump in here.
Would let's say a male that likes, let's say, knitting and maybe cooking and stuff like that, but it's still straight.
Okay. Yep. If you're gender nonconforming, you don't. That's exactly right. You don't do the things or dress in ways or act in ways that are stereotypical to your gender. So if I'm a guy who likes to wear kind of flowy floral top every once in a while, I might be gender nonconforming that day. Or if I'm a guy who, yes, likes to sew, I might be considered gender nonconforming. So, you know, it's really thinking about stereotypical how you describe a certain gender. And so that might, those things would be gender nonconforming. There are lots of folks in our entertainment industry that we consider gender nonconforming. Can you think of any of them that you'd be willing to shout out and name?
What's that? Jonathan Van Ness, maybe?
Correct, from Queer Eye. Jonathan Van Ness wears kind of long hair and skirts a lot of times. And so he's gender nonconforming. He wears makeup also. Let's see, there's Harry Styles, who is considered gender nonconforming. There's, I think Lil Nas X is considered gender nonconforming. So there's lots of different stars out there who are considered gender nonconforming as well. And so if you think about it, it's really, you know, somebody who doesn't always dress or appear in a very stereotypical way. Good question. Is that also known as metrosexual? Yes. I mean, somebody who's metro is really those more, I think, stereotypically characterized as somebody who might be, it's usually a male who has a very good sense of fashion, who might also blur the lines a little bit, who carries a male handbag, doesn't call it a purse. You know, if you're is still, I think, very much dresses maybe as male, but is a little more in touch maybe with their feminine side, or is not so stereotypical in how they dress as a male. So yeah, that, I guess you could see, it just depends on what part of that metrosexual you're on, if you would identify as that. Usually it's somebody who has a very good understanding of you know, of culture also as well. And so it's somebody who's kind of metro. But yes, they're kind of on that spectrum. Somebody who's gender nonconforming is somebody who might be comfortable wearing is more somebody who might be male, who might be comfortable wearing a dress one day, and the next day wear a suit. You know, just one day they flow in and out of that. They're very, they might do something that you would think would be stereotypically female one day and more stereotypically male the next. Okay, so just 1 second. We have Demi boy and Demi girl. That's really in the trans, among folks who are trans, that somebody who's not interested in fully transitioning. So they might be someone, they might be a female who identifies as a male, who takes hormones to gain a deeper voice and who grows facial hair, but they're not interested in having surgery. That's a demi boy. So there's demi boy or demi girl. Then we get to the term of binary and non-binary. We're almost done with the terms. If you're binary or non-binary, does anybody know what being binary means?
Wait, so it was
All these terms come from? Like, is it just like an evolution of?
That's a great question. Where did all these terms come from. It's really a way that I think the LGBTQ community has tried to find ways to develop their a language to describe themselves. And so sometimes they draw them from other parts of of language to describe other things. So this is a good reference point. Binary and non-binary was originally used in computer science for computer programming. If you're a computer nerd, you know about binary code. And binary code is the code behind all of computer work that uses ones and zeros to code all of the language behind your whole computer to run a program. And binary code are ones and zeros. If you think of a 1 as a male and a 0 as a female, if you're binary, you're either male or female. If you're non-binary, you're something else other than male or female. And so as folks who are part of the LGBTQ community, we're trying to find a way to describe themselves. They borrowed from computer science and programming language. So if you say you're binary, it means you're very much identify as a male or a female. And if you're non-binary, you're really something in between. You might be gender non-conforming. You might identify as neither male or female. So so sometimes we borrow from other areas to term ourselves. This is HRT and SRS are medical terms that are used in the trans community for hormone replacement therapy and for sexual reassignment surgery. So that really just has to do with taking hormones or having the surgery to become a male or female. Then there's drag king and drag queen, and I bring those up as terminology because they're often misunderstood, and often folks think that someone who's transgender is also a drag queen, and that's not the case. They're very different. Being a drag queen is really stereotypically someone who is a male who wants to perform as a female, and they do so with exaggerated makeup and hair and dress. But there's in their regular life, they in their everyday life, they dress as a man. But when they're a drag queen, they're in a performance mode, dressing as a woman. That's very different than being transgender. Transgender is when you're born a man and you very much identify internally as a woman and want to express that permanently in your life, and you're not performing, you're trying to live you're wanting to live your life as the sex that you feel like you truly are. So I bring that up, just don't get those confused. Sometimes people do, but being a drag queen is someone who's male who performs in an exaggerated way as a woman. Same way with being a drag king is a female who performs in a way as a man. We have ally, which we've talked about before. That's somebody who doesn't identify as LGBTQ+, but who supports those who are. And we talked about our phobias before, and so transphobia is one of those things that some people have. It's really a misunderstanding about trans folks. Finally, we have what's called the alphabet soup. The alphabet soup is just a series of letters that folks who are part of the community identify with. And you'll see that there's LGBTQ, there's LGBT. You'll see on the lower right-hand side, there's TBLG. It doesn't really matter how you shuffle those letters of the alphabet, but some folks in the community might not think they get enough recognition. Let's say if you're trans and you're LGBT, and you might say, well, our group always comes last. So when they're making their flyer, they might decide they're TBLG. They're part of the TBLG community. It's really all the same community. It's just they want some recognition first, and I get that. That's okay. So we're going to go through you see the big long letter, the big long series of letters there. We're going to identify each one of those kind of collectively. And so I just want you to call them out as we go through them, just to see what your understanding is of those so far. So let's start with L.
Lesbian.
Okay, G.
Gay.
Gay.
Very good. B.
Bisexual.
Very good. T.
Transgender.
Trans. Yep. Q.
Queer.
Queer.
Queer. The other Q, which we didn't really talk about.
Questioning.
Questioning. Very good. You're part of the community if you're questioning and trying to figure out who you are. Then there's I.
Guess intersex.
Intersex. A.
Asexual.
Asexual. And the other A is?
Ambiguous. I have no idea.
It's the one right above that series of letters, ally.
Ally.
You're part of the, if you're not part of the community of those letters, but you support them, you're part of the community too. You're an ally. So, do we want to say LGBTQIAA all the time? No, that's too hard to say. So we usually just say LGBTQ plus or LGBT plus. The plus really implies that there are lots of other identifiers there. And so it's just easier to say that, and you won't offend anybody usually by saying that. I had a friend of mine who says, well, yeah, if you look at all those letters, there's not a P in there for pan or a B in there for binary. So, the plus really implies all of those people. Any questions?
Sorry, I got interrupted by a work call, but on binary, non-binary, is there a dress type or a certain type of dress that they use, depending on whether they're binary or non-binary?
A certain type of
How they dress.
Well, if you're binary and you're in the US, you identify stereotypically as a male or female. Then if you're male, you said a certain type of dress.
Well, I mean, yeah, like for example, for gender expression, is there a difference between non-binary and having a
and gender non-conforming? They're really about the same. If you're non-binary, it's another way to say that you're gender non-conforming. If you're binary, you're usually gender conforming. Does that make sense?
Yes, that clears it up. Thank you.
Okay. Some of these terms are new and emerging. So cisgender and binary non-binary are two kind of newest terms in the community. And so even those of us who are part of the LGBTQ community, if we haven't heard them a lot, then we say, whoa, wait a minute. And we do the same thing as you. We kind of ask those same questions. What are you talking about there? Just know that language is something that's always evolving and changing. So we add new terms all the time, and some of them fall off also. I'm going to play a little video for you here. Let's see here. It'll load for me. For some reason, my computer has been slow to load.
While that's loading, I just want to say I feel so included as an ally. I didn't realize that other A was for ally.
Yes. Just a second. Here we go.
All right, folks, here we go. A romaine and kale salad with avocado, cucumber, shishito peppers, and 4 kinds of cheese. Sprinkled in balsamic straight from Italy.
Wow. In my day, salads only had 2 ingredients. A rock-hard wedge of iceberg lettuce and a sticky old dried-up tomato.
Sorry, guys. I'm gonna have to eat fast. Alex is stopping by in a few minutes to work on a robotics project.
Alex, is that the girl with that weird dog? Or the boy with the hat with the wings that flap?
No, Uncle Jay. This is Alex.
Oh, okay. I remember. A very nice young... come to think of it, well, is Alex a boy or a girl?
Actually, Alex doesn't define themselves as boy or girl.
What else is there?
Back in your day, most people understood the world in terms of just boys and girls. But now we know gender is more complex than that.
Wait, aren't we just talking about whether you're born with a or a
When you're born, your sex is assigned in a medical way, but the sex listed on your birth certificate may not necessarily match your gender identity.
Gender identity is a person's inner experience of who they are in terms of gender, their deep personal sense of being male, female, a blend of both, or neither.
And while many people have a gender identity that's the same as their assigned birth sex of female or male, that's not always the case because gender exists on a spectrum. Like transgender, which means a person whose gender identity is not consistent with their assigned birth sex. Non-binary, which means a person whose identity doesn't fall in the category of either male or female. And genderqueer or gender fluid, which means a person who does not identify themselves as having a specific gender at all.
Does gender identity have to do with being straight or gay?
Actually, no. Gender identity has to do with the way you feel about yourself, while sexual orientation is based on the way you feel toward others, the people you may or may not be attracted to.
You know, I really like Alex, and I can tell they're a good friend to you, but I'm still pretty confused about all of this.
That's okay. You don't have to fully understand someone to respect them. To start, try not to make any assumptions about a person's gender, and use the name and pronouns that they ask you to. Above all, be a friend or ally for people of all gender identities.
That's right, Mom. Oh, Alex is here. Come on in.
Hey, everyone.
Oh, hey, Alex. Care for some salad? The balsamic's right from Italy, you know.
Just 1 second here. There we go. I just have a few more slides and then we'll talk a little more informally. Why do we use so many labels? That question gets asked a lot, and even inside our own LGBTQ community. If you think that's a great question, and if you think about that question, think about your own self and the labels you use to describe yourself. For me, I like to exercise and run. So I describe myself as somebody who's part of the Corpus Christi Tri Club, the triathlon club, because I like to bike and run and swim. So that's a label that I put on myself. I'm spiritual and religious, so I like to go to church. So I'd say I'm a United Methodist. Well, that's a label that I put on myself. If you're somebody who maybe likes to hang out at a certain bar, you might say, hey, I'm the guy who's always at Dewey's Beer Garden. It's a label you put on yourself. For me, myself, I'm a redheaded and very white skin and freckle faced. And so I have names in my family that end in Kirkpatrick and Bailey and Kennedy, and they're all very Irish. And so I may say that I'm a proud Irish American. That's a label that I put on myself. We use labels to describe ourselves in so many ways of our life. And so for someone who has really wrestled with their gender identity and expression, for them to identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community is really important for them. It helps them to tell themselves and other people who they belong to and who they most identify with. And it's important for them for developing a sense of community and a sense of self to have that identity. It reduces isolation. It helps them find peers who can understand a little bit more and who they are. And so those labels are important for them to use. So just know that if there's somebody who's part of the LGBTQ plus community, having that specific label as being pan or being bi or being non-binary might be really important for them to use. And so please just remember to respect that as well. Just among youth who are LGBTQ, they report higher levels of bullying, more depression, Some of them don't get the counseling and the therapy that they might need to try to figure all this out. And so they may self-medicate with by substance abuse and alcohol abuse. They have a much higher level of suicide attempts and suicidal thoughts. And there are some health disparities that go along with that. According to the CDC, LGBTQ youth are 6 times more likely to report high levels of depression, are 3 times more likely to use illegal drugs, are 8 times more likely than non-LGBT youth to have tried to commit suicide, are 3 times more likely to have risky sex, and are less likely to go for sexual health checkups because they may have been denied health access by a medical provider due to the fact that they were LGBTQ or had a bad experience with a medical team who didn't understand what they needed as somebody who's part of the LGBTQ population. So just know that as well when you're dealing with youth who identify that way, also in conservative South Texas, I've grown up here, I know the landscape well, that they may have been kicked out of their home because their home might have family who are homophobic and who don't understand what being LGBTQ is about, or they may have family who are maybe religiously conservative and don't think that that they are living the way God would want them to, and so sometimes our youth maybe don't have a home to go to because they've been kicked out or are couch surfing with friends for a place to stay. Also, if you identify as trans, you have greater difficulty getting a job and keeping a job. You have difficulties with finding an appropriate restroom to go to. A lot of times you're harassed and fetishized and asked a lot of questions because maybe you identify as female and you're trying to dress and be female, but you don't quite look that way yet. So there are a bunch of issues with the LGBTQ community that have to do with how they identify. And so it just helps, I think, to know that. Let's see. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes. Let me stop sharing for a minute, and I'm going to talk about a few other things. I know I only have you for probably about 10 or 15 more minutes if my understanding is correct. One of the things that was brought up before is about well, 2 things that kind of were asked that I want to address were how do I address somebody who identifies as LGBTQ? What pronouns do I use for them? And you know, what are some things that I can do to you know, be accepting and an ally to a youth who I encounter. So with the first part, just know that if you identify as trans, that you might want to use a different name or pronoun, or if you identify as more gender fluid, you might want to do that as well. And especially if you're a youth, you might be trying that out for the first time. And so it's really important if you're a youth to and if you're talking with youth to ask them. One of the things that we do here at the Pride Center is when we are introduced to a new client, we ask, you know, we just tell them, I want to respect who you are, and so what name would you prefer to be called by, and what are your pronouns? And that's really a good starting point for folks, and especially if we can't tell if they're trans or not. A lot of times people who walk in the door who are trans, we just don't know, and so it helps to just kind of make that part of our introduction is to say that. And there are ways that you can do that to communicate that even subtly. You see on my screen when I'm talking to you that there's my name and my pronouns that are listed there. That's also in my emails that I send out. And that's been increasingly popular as folks communicate because it communicates to someone else that you're LGBTQ friendly in a very subtle way. That somebody who might not outwardly identify that to you might know that you're a safe person to talk to, that you'll be understanding for who they are. And so those are some very simple things you can do. And to honor what they say. So if they look like a male, but say, let's say I come to you and I'm a client and I look very masculine and like a male and say I want to be called Jane and use she, her pronouns, then do that. For someone who is really struggling with their identity, for you to honor them really communicates a lot about to them about the person that you are. And so call me Jane and use she, her pronouns. And it's hard to do. We're visual folks. We live in a visual society. And so you may see me and think he, him pronouns. And so it really takes a lot of effort when you're not used to doing that, to use she, her pronouns and to remember to do it.
Barton, for me with the pronouns, I totally get the he, him, his, her, hers.
Okay.
But she. But what about the they, them? What's the other one? That's the one that I'm not quite sure.
Okay, great question. Some people, when they're trying to figure out who they are, let's say they don't really identify with one gender or another, they're more gender fluid, if they're that way, then they may say, well, some days I feel like he, him, some days I feel more she, her, I'm just more gender fluid that way. And so I really prefer to use they, them pronouns because I really don't identify as strictly female or strictly male. And we're not used to that a lot in life. But if they say that, then honor that. Sometimes they'll say, well, I don't care what you call me. I mean, in terms of pronouns, if it's he, him, or she, her, or they, them, I'll answer to any of those. And it's great. But some people very much want they, them pronouns. And they choose some gender neutral names that aren't specifically male or specifically female. And it's because they don't really feel strongly that they're one sex or another. So I don't know if that helps. Also, if you're afraid of making a mistake, let's say you meet somebody for the first time and you're like, I don't know now, I'm so confused with what Barton told me. Do I use he, him, or she, her? I don't know what to use. Well, I once heard a receptionist tell me, she said, Barton, the way I fix all of that so I don't ever offend anybody is that I always use they, them. So when somebody walks to the front desk and says, I really want to talk to the nurse in the back, well, she would pick up the phone in front of the client and say, hi, Nurse Nancy, I am calling for a client and they would like to talk to you. You hear that? They didn't say she would like to talk to you or he would like to talk to you. They just say they would like to talk to you. And she said, I found when I use they, them pronouns, if I didn't know, I never offended anybody. Because in life, we're so used to kind of putting they and them in a lot of places that's really not considered offensive to us. And so if you don't know, when all else, kind of the rule to fall back on is if you don't want to offend somebody, just use a they, them pronoun, and it works a lot easier. Have I been perfect at this? No, I mess it up all the time. I'm human. And so when that happens, take a breath, realize that you might be the 50th person that day who mispronounced that person, who wanted to be called she, her, and that person might get really mad at you, and listen to them and let them rant for a minute and apologize. And you don't have to fall over all over yourself doing it. You have to say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I can't believe I did that. You know, you don't have to go, you don't have to just apologize 100 times. Just say, oh, I'm so sorry, you're right, you know, you asked for me to use she her pronouns and I mispronounced you, and then go on, and try not to mess that up again. And if you do, apologize again. It happens. It just happens. Nicole, did you have a question?
I keep going on and off because I keep thinking all these questions. I, you know, as CASA volunteers, we're advocating for our kids, and we want to make sure that they feel comfortable and supported. So how can we do that in a courtroom setting to make sure that they're being honored?
That's a great question. And, you know, in a courtroom setting, I think if you know them well enough to, and have gotten to know them well enough, then part of the courtroom setting is if you're interacting or if you're helping others interact and you're acting on their behalf, is to make sure that the people around you also know that this child wants to use they them pronouns, or this child wants to be addressed in a certain way by a certain name. And if it's, and also if that happens incorrectly, that you intervene on their behalf and say, no, it's not, I know their legal name is listed as Sam, but they want to be called Genevieve, you know, and please refer to them as Genevieve, you know, and so to advocate in that way for them. If they're youth or children that maybe you're getting to know and you're not sure, you know, how they identify, and you meet with them in maybe an office space and want them to feel like this is a safe space for them. Sometimes something so simple as having a pride flag in your pen holder communicates to a client that you're LGBTQ friendly. To having a rainbow flag in your pen holder, or sometimes we have little stickers that say safe zone. Seeing that on the front of a building communicates that as you walk in the door. It's a window decal. And sometimes just you know, asking them, how do you want me, you know, what name do you want me to call you, you know, is a way of honoring them too. Those are some things that I can think of just right offhand. Did that answer your question, Nicole?
Absolutely did. And I just want to point out to the volunteers on here and whoever might be watching later that Texas CASA is really moving through steps to try to be more inclusive with our terminology and paperwork, with our mission statement. So you might start to see some different verbiage rolling out. One of the things we're doing to try to be more inclusive, especially with parents, is referring to them as the family of origin instead of saying biological parents, because those kids could be coming from a family, maybe they were adopted to begin with. They might have 2 dads or 2 moms. And so using family of origin instead of, you know, labeling that is what we're trying to move towards. So you might start to see that coming out now, you know, pretty soon here in the future.
That's a great comment, Nicole, and I'm glad to hear that, and bring some other thoughts to mind. Yes, and sometimes in the LGBTQ community, we have families of origin and we have families of choice. Because some of those youth who then become adults maybe were abandoned by their family of origin, and so they've had to find a new family, and so they have families of choice that they then own. You know, you were talking about some of the language, and so I think it is important to really be aware of that. You said something else that I had a good point to, and I forgot. You're talking about that. I'm sorry, I just forgot it. But some of those things are really good to consider. let me think for a minute and see if I can
I was
come back.
talking about being more inclusive with our verbiage.
Yeah, and you know, sometimes as CASA looks at that, lots of different organizations have looked at that. Oh, that's what, thank you. That's what I was going to say. Really think about how things are changing right now in terms of the verbiage you use with two specific kinds of language. When we refer to spouse and we refer to partner. Those are really important because most of the time in our cis world, when we refer to spouse, what do we think of? We think of what? A husband and a
Wife.
Right? But in this day and age, that is not the case. A spouse could be a woman and a woman, or a man and a man. And so don't automatically assume when somebody says my spouse that that's a husband and wife, a male and female relationship. It could be, but it might not be. So that, and also partner is another one that we have a lot of confusion on. It used to be when somebody referred to their partner, you automatically assumed what? They were gay.
Yeah,
They're
gay.
Right? If they refer to partner. Well, in this day and age, when somebody has been with the same person, let's say they're a female who's been with a male for 15 years but never gotten married formally, there's not a good word for that. You don't really want to say boyfriend because you've been with that person for too long. You know, if you're a female who's been with that male for a long period of time but not gotten married, you really don't want to say my spouse because they're not really your spouse if you haven't formally gotten married. And so some folks use the term partner, and my partner. So don't just automatically assume the other way too, that, oh, if that lady says my partner, that means she's lesbian. She may not be. She may have a guy that she's been with for the last 15 years, but they've just never decided to get married. And that's the best term that she has in her mind for that person. So you can even clarify that, you know. So what do you mean when you say partner? Just for my own clarification, you know, what do you mean when you say spouse? If that's important to part of the conversation that you're having.
And something just popped in my head too, even when we're talking to our kids and we're wanting to ask about their life, but if you go in talking to a girl and say, so tell me, do you have any boyfriend? That might just completely shut them down from opening up about their sexuality or their preference. So maybe just asking, are you interested in anybody? Or, you know, that might be a different tune.
You're exactly right. Some of the subtle ways that we do things really communicate a lot. So if you want to be as open and inclusive to others, then really think about your choice of language. So yeah, so if you say, well, when you start dating and then you start talking about, let's say if you're talking to a girl and you start talking about boys, then they may withhold really ever telling you, well, I'm really interested in girls in my own sex, or I'm really not interested in dating at all. You know, so leave that open-ended if you can remember to do that in a conversation. It's really changing your way of thinking, and it's hard to do, I know, because we've been conditioned to do that. And just like we've been conditioned to say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, as a sign of respect. And I say I was raised that way. And so, don't say yes, sir, to somebody unless you know they're a guy, like identify as a guy.
That has totally happened to me before.
You may really end up offending them. And so to just be polite and say yes and say please and thank you, but take the gender specificity out of it. Even with the kids that you might interact with, you know, and we have some folks who work in our clinics and in nursing, and they'll use honey or sweetie or one of those terms because they but even those don't work well to me. Just kind of take all that out of it, and just because some of that can be a little degrading feeling. Just say yes or no, and please and thank you.
Well, I've got to tell you, Barton, this training has been amazing. I see you're starting to thunder here, so I'm gone. It's because I lost power. I just want to tell you, I'm really appreciative of you coming today. I learned so much, and I try to go into as many trainings as I possibly can. I still learn so much. So I'm very excited. Does anybody have any questions before we get going?
Hey, my question, Mr. Barton, is do you find it maybe harder in the Hispanic Latin community for someone to come out? Because I know, there's a lot of macho, and I've seen it myself with my nephew. He had a hard time coming out to his family because they were just not having it. And you could tell from a small age that he wasn't going to be male, like a straight male. And they just weren't accepting of it at all. I mean, he's 20 now, and thank goodness that they have accepted it. But it's still hard with his grandma and grandpa, the older generations that don't think it's okay. And do you have any suggestions on how to maybe get them to come around a little bit better with him?
That's a great question. In terms of the Latinx community, if you think of typically somebody in South Texas who identifies as Hispanic American or Latino, usually there's a very predominance in that cultural setting of being Roman Catholic, also of having some machismo among the men, of having some very defined gender roles. And that's not just specific to being Hispanic American. That happens in lots of other cultural communities as well. But yes, because of some of those instances, it can be harder to come out. It's also changing. And I've been seeing that needle move a little bit more. And even in South Texas, there's becoming more acceptance for that. So, the way we change that is to continue to have dialogue about that. If you have a set of grandparents or parents that you're dealing with in CASA, then you educate them as well, and you encourage them to maybe come see me. I'll be glad to we talk to parents and grandparents all the time who say, I want to support my grandchild, I just don't know what to do, and I wasn't raised this way, and that's okay. But you help them start to open the door, and you also tell them, if they're being very resistant, if you can tell them, hey, look, do you want a relationship with your kid or your grandkid? Because if you love them, you want to do everything you can to understand them, and I want to help you do that.
Amazing, thank you. Any other questions?
Mm-mm.
All right, Barton. Well, thank you so very much. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. I really, really appreciate you being here today. And
sure, and thank you for all you do at CASA. I am always amazed and very appreciative of everything that all of you do.
So if we want to be certified for like a safe zone, to have that sticker put on our door, what do we need to do?
Well, basically what I gave you today was a good chunk of that. And so I'd be glad to send you some of those stickers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Barton. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. And everybody, I will be putting this into Optima for you. And if you're watching this on the recording, just make sure you put it in for yourself after you're done. So thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.